My name is Harold Bennett. I am 82 years old. It's late while I'm recording this. The house makes small sounds at night. The refrigerator hums. The pipes knock once in a while. I used to hate those noises. Now they remind me I'm still here to hear them. I don't know how much time I have left. None of us do, I suppose. But when you're past 80, the question feels less like philosophy and more like weather. It's just there. Quiet. Unavoidable. I retired 17 years ago. I thought retirement would feel like a wide open field. I imagined waking up light, free. I pictured long mornings with coffee and no clock watching me. But the truth is, I carried too much with me into that field. I didn't set anything down. I brought my old angers, my old fears, my old need to prove something. I packed them carefully the way I used to pack my briefcase for work, as if they were necessary tools. I didn't know they were weights. For 43 years I worked at the same manufacturing plant. Steel parts, loud machines, grease under my nails that never quite came out. I started there when I was 23. I had a newborn daughter and a second-hand car that stalled at red lights. I told myself I would only stay a few years. Then a few years became a life. I became a supervisor in my 40s. I wore press shirts. I signed papers. I learned how to speak sharply so men would listen. I learned how to swallow words so the higher-ups would approve. Somewhere in there I stopped noticing what it was doing to me. I remember one winter evening, snow coming down heavy. My son had a school play. He was 9. He had one line, just one. I stayed late at the plant because a shipment was wrong. I told myself it was important. I told myself my family would understand. By the time I got to the school, the parking lot was nearly empty. The custodian was stacking chairs. My wife stood by the door with my son's coat over her arm. She didn't yell, she didn't cry. She just said, "You missed it." I nodded. I said something about work, about responsibility. My son wouldn't look at me. That moment stayed with me longer than any promotion. But I didn't change. Not really. I carried that guilt like something sharp in my pocket. I would feel it sometimes, press against it, and then cover it back up with busyness. When I finally retired at 65, there was a cake in the break room, a gold watch, a speech I barely remember. People clapped. I drove home at 3 in the afternoon in daylight on a weekday. It felt strange. I sat in my car in the driveway for a long time before going inside. I thought I was stepping into freedom. Instead, I stepped into myself. All the things I had pushed aside came forward when the noise of work disappeared. The silence was louder than the machines had ever been. I noticed how quick I still was to get irritated. How easily I corrected my wife's stories. How I kept score of small things that didn't matter. I had retired from my job, but I hadn't retired from my habits. There was resentment I still held toward my younger brother. We hadn't spoken in years over an argument about our parents' house. It was petty, if I'm honest. Money and pride and who did more. I told myself I was justified. I told myself time would sort it out. Time sorted it out in its own way. He died of a heart attack at 71. Sudden. No warning. The hospital called me because my number was still listed as emergency contact. I drove there with my hands shaking on the wheel. I stood beside his bed and looked at a face that looked like mine, only thinner. I tried to remember the last thing I had said to him. It wasn't kind. I realized then that I had been carrying something useless and heavy for decades, and now there was nowhere to put it down. After he was gone, I went home and sat in my kitchen in the dark. My wife asked if I wanted the light on. I said no. It felt fitting to sit with it. I began to see that I had been living as if there would always be time to soften, time to apologize, time to explain. Retirement doesn't create that time. It only exposes how you've used it. I used to think the burdens in my life were obvious things. The mortgage, the deadlines, the long hours, but those weren't the heaviest parts. The heaviest parts were the grudges I polished, the pride I protected, the fear of looking weak, the constant measuring of my worth by how busy I was. Even after I stopped working, I kept waking up early, as if I still had to earn the day. I'd sit at the kitchen table with my coffee and feel a tightness in my chest, not physical pain, just pressure. Like I was behind on something invisible. It took me years to understand that I was behind on my own life. My wife, Margaret, she adjusted to retirement faster than I did. She would read in the afternoons, tend to her small garden, call the grandchildren just to hear their voices. I would pace. I'd reorganize the garage, critique the news, complain about politicians who didn't know I existed. One afternoon she looked at me and said very gently, "You don't have to fight anymore." I didn't know what she meant, but the words stayed with me. For most of my life I was fighting something: bills, expectations, other men at work, even my own father's memory. He was a quiet man, hard, rarely praised me. When I became a supervisor, I imagined him nodding with approval. He had been dead 10 years by then. I was still trying to win something from someone who wasn't there, and I carried that into retirement too. I thought if I kept improving the house, managing the finances perfectly, staying informed, staying sharp, I would still matter. But mattering isn't the same as being present. I began to notice small things I had missed for years. The way Margaret's hands trembled slightly when she buttoned her sweater. The way the afternoon light hit the hallway wall in winter. I noticed that my body was slower. My knees ached when I stood up. My hearing faded a little each year. And underneath it all I noticed how tired I was. Not just physically. Tired of holding on to things that had already taken their toll. There was a night about 5 years into retirement when Margaret and I were sitting on the couch. The television was on, but neither of us were really watching. She said, "Do you ever feel lighter now?" I opened my mouth to say yes, but I stopped. Because I didn't. I had more time, but I wasn't lighter. That realization came slowly. Like a leak you don't notice until the floor is already wet. I began to see the patterns of my own mind. The constant replaying of old arguments, the imagined conversations where I finally said the perfect line, the way I kept justifying past decisions to an invisible jury. No one else was holding those trials anymore. Only me, and it was exhausting. I remember one morning standing in front of the bathroom mirror. I looked at my face, the sagging skin, the age spots, the thin white hair. I tried to remember the last time I felt completely at ease. I couldn't. Not in my 30s. Not in my 40s. Not even in my 60s. I had always been bracing. For what, I'm not even sure. Retirement didn't remove the bracing. It simply revealed how long I had been doing it. And that's when the thought first came to me. Not as a lesson, not as a grand idea, but as a quiet question. What have I been carrying all this time, and why? I didn't sit down and make a list. I didn't have some dramatic breakthrough. It was smaller than that. It was noticing that my shoulders hurt less on the days I didn't argue with the past. It was noticing that when I let a memory pass without defending myself, the room felt bigger. It was noticing that when I called my daughter just to listen instead of correct, the conversation lasted longer. These were small shifts, almost invisible, but they were the first times I felt even slightly lighter. I think we believe we'll set things down when we reach a certain age, as if the calendar itself will make us gentler. It doesn't. We bring ourselves wherever we go. And I brought a man who didn't know how to rest. I'm still learning, even now at 82, what it means to loosen my grip. Sometimes I sit in the backyard and let the sun warm my face. I don't check the time. I don't plan the next task. I just sit. It feels unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, but also honest. There are things I can't undo. My brother is still gone. My son's childhood still holds my absences. My wife still carries memories of arguments I barely remember. Those costs are real. They don't disappear just because I finally understand something. And that's the part that weighs on me most. Not that I carried so much, but that I carried it for so long. I used to think strength was endurance, holding on, pushing through. Now, sitting here in the quiet of this house, I'm beginning to suspect it might have been something else entirely, something softer, something I learned too late to practice fully. I'll tell you what I've come to see. But it's not a lesson, it's just what's left when the noise fades. When the noise fades, what's left is not the achievements, it's not the titles, not the framed certificates in the hallway that no one really stops to read anymore. What's left is the feeling in your chest when you wake up before the sun. For a long time mine felt tight. I used to lie there beside Margaret and run through old scenes in my head. Conversations from 30 years ago. Decisions I defended over and over again, even though no one was arguing with me anymore. It felt like I was still reporting for duty somewhere, still preparing my case. There was one memory that came back often. I must have been 52. My daughter Claire had just gone through a difficult divorce. She came over one evening, eyes red, voice shaking. She sat at our kitchen table, the same table I'm sitting at now, and she told me she felt like she had failed. I remember listening, and then I remember fixing. I told her what she should have done differently, how she could rebuild, how she needed to be stronger for the children. She got quiet. At the time I thought I was helping. Years later, after retirement, she mentioned that night in passing. She said gently, I didn't need solutions. I just needed my dad. She didn't say it with blame, but I heard it anyway. That stayed with me. I realized I had carried this constant need to be useful, to solve, to manage, to control outcomes, even when there was nothing to manage, even when what was needed was simply presence. I had mistaken control for care. That's a hard thing to admit at 82. There were other things I held on to, old comparisons. I'd look at neighbors who traveled more than we did and feel something sour rise up. I'd think about colleagues who made more money and wonder if I should have pushed harder. Retirement didn't silence that voice. It made it louder at first. There's a lot of space in a day when you're no longer working. Space can be peaceful, but it can also be filled with old judgments if you're not careful. I didn't notice how often I measured my life against invisible rulers. How much did I earn? How respected was I? Did my children turn out exactly as planned? Did my house look right? Did I age well? I was still competing, even with no finish line. One afternoon about 10 years ago, I was cleaning out the attic. Boxes of papers, old tax returns, performance reviews, letters from the company praising my dedication. I sat cross-legged on the dusty floor and read through one of those reviews from 1989. Exceeds expectations, demonstrates strong leadership under pressure. I remember how proud I felt receiving that. Sitting in the attic decades later, I tried to feel that same pride. I couldn't. It felt distant, almost like it belonged to someone else. Then I found a drawing my son had made when he was little, crayon on cheap paper. It was of me standing beside a giant machine. My arms were drawn too long, my head too small. At the top he had written, in shaky letters, "My dad works a lot." I stared at that longer than any performance review. The attic was hot. My knees hurt from the floor. I felt something shift inside me. I began to see the burden I had mistaken for responsibility. The constant proving, the endless preparing for some future version of peace. I had lived as if peace would arrive after the next milestone, after the promotion, after the mortgage was paid, after retirement. But peace doesn't arrive like a package at the door. If it's not inside you already, retirement won't install it. I don't say that as advice. I say it as someone who waited, and waited, and then woke up one morning at 75, realizing that Margaret's hair had turned almost completely white while I was still thinking about work meetings that no longer mattered. There was also fear. I don't think I admitted that to myself for most of my life. Fear of not being enough. Fear of losing status. Fear of growing irrelevant. When the company announced automation upgrades in my late 50s, I felt threatened. Younger men who understood computers better were suddenly valued differently. I worked harder, stayed later, took it personally, as if the machines were replacing me. In retirement, that fear didn't vanish. It just changed shape. It became fear of being forgotten, of being unnecessary. I would call my children more often than needed, sometimes disguising it as checking in. If they didn't answer right away, I'd feel a sting I couldn't quite name. I was still trying to secure my place. Margaret saw it before I did. One evening she said, "You don't have to earn love." I remember feeling defensive. Of course I knew that. Of course I did. But deep down I wasn't sure I believed it. I had spent decades earning everything else. Why would love be different? That was another burden I carried quietly. The idea that my value was tied to output. Even now at 82, when I can't lift what I used to lift, when I need help opening jars, I feel that old instinct to apologize for taking up space. It's a strange thing to realize how early those ideas settle into a person. I also carried regret like a private ledger. Moments I replayed. The time I snapped at Margaret over something small, a misplaced bill, and saw hurt flicker across her face. The vacations where I was physically present but mentally drafting emails. The evenings I chose the television over conversation because I was too tired. I used to defend those choices. Now they sit quietly in me. Not screaming, just present. The cost of misunderstanding what mattered. Margaret's health began to decline 3 years ago. Nothing dramatic at first. Just slower steps. More doctor visits. I found myself afraid in a way I hadn't been before. Afraid of losing her. Afraid of being alone in this house with all these echoes. And in that fear something softened. The old argument seemed foolish. The need to be right felt ridiculous. We began sitting together more in silence, not because we had nothing to say, but because words weren't always necessary. I started telling her things I hadn't said before, simple things, that I was grateful she stayed through my worst years, that I was sorry for the times I chose pride over tenderness. She would squeeze my hand and say, "I know." I don't know if she truly did, but she let me say it. That's when I understood something that had been available all along. Most of the burdens I carried were self-constructed. Old identities, old defenses, old roles I refused to retire from, even after the job ended. I think about the word retire differently now. It isn't just about leaving work. It's about releasing the parts of yourself that no longer serve love. I didn't know that at 65. I thought retirement was a finish line. It was more like a mirror. It showed me what I had become while chasing other things. Some of what I saw I didn't like, but it was honest. Now at 82 I wake up slower. I sit longer before standing. I listen more. The house is quieter these days. Margaret naps often in the afternoon. I watch her breathe sometimes, just to steady myself. I don't know how many more years I have, but I do know this. The heaviest things I carried were never in my hands. They were in my heart, and they took up space that could have been filled with something gentler. If you're listening to this and you're somewhere before the age I am now, I'm not trying to tell you what to do. I wouldn't dare. I've already spent a lifetime thinking I knew better. I'm just telling you what it feels like to reach the end of a long road and realize you were gripping stones you could have set down years ago. It's a quiet realization, not dramatic, just a soft ache mixed with a little relief. I'm still setting things down, even now. Old resentments that flare up and then fade. The need to correct every small mistake in a story. The urge to defend myself when no one is attacking. It's slower work at this age. But it feels honest. If nothing else, maybe stay with that thought for a moment. The thought of what you're carrying, and whether it truly needs to follow you all the way to the end. I'm going to sit here a while longer tonight. Listen to the house breathe, and let a few more things go. Some nights the house is too quiet. I wake in the middle of them, and the silence feels like a mirror. I see myself in it, the man I was, the man I became, the man I am trying to be, all in one reflection, not separate, not tidy, just me with all my mistakes, regrets, and small victories tangled together. I think about my son Claire and my grandchildren, how fast they move, how little they notice the quiet details I used to obsess over. The afternoons I spent correcting, instructing, planning, gone. They're living in a different rhythm now. I see it in the way they laugh, how they forget to call but still find their way back. I realize I was never really in charge of their lives, only my own perception of them. Sometimes I sit in the living room and look at the walls, photographs of birthdays, anniversaries, vacations that felt important at the time. I see the faces, smiling, unaware of the burdens I carried on their behalf. I remember arguments, snide remarks, prideful stubbornness. I feel the weight of those moments again, and then I exhale, because holding on to them does nothing now. I remember one afternoon last spring. The sunlight came through the window in long stripes. Margaret was asleep in her chair, and I was reading a book I didn't really understand. I closed it and just watched her. I realized I was finally resting, not the sort of rest where you pretend to relax while the mind races, but the real kind, the one that comes when you let some burdens go. It's strange how long it takes to notice the obvious. How many decades I spent carrying shadows like they were gold. How many years I thought pride was a shield, when it was really a chain. How many mornings I woke with tight shoulders, only to tighten them further in imaginary battles. I don't want to suggest this is a lesson for anyone. That's not what I'm doing here. I'm not a guide. I'm a man sitting in the late afternoon of his life, noticing what matters now that much of what once seemed essential has slipped away. I am Harold Bennett, 82, and for the first time I can feel that the weight I carried is slowly lifting. Some of it will stay, it can't all leave. There are scars and absences that mark the shape of my life, but some of it just a little I can set down quietly. I want to sit with that a while longer. I want to remember the soft laughter of my grandchildren, the smell of Margaret's garden in the morning, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards that sound like time itself breathing, all of it, the burdens, the regrets, the waiting part of me. But finally I am learning to place them down. If you've stayed with me this far, maybe take a moment to think about what you carry. Not as advice, not as instruction, just reflection. Quiet reflection like I am doing tonight. The house is still. The night presses against the windows. I hear the occasional car pass by, and I am here, present, letting a few things go, and I am grateful for that. If you've been with me this long, I'll just say, take a quiet moment tonight. Notice what you're carrying. Let some of it rest, even if just for a little while.